Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us, Art Basel, Miami Beach Conversations. This is Activism and the Institution. One small note is that Mr. Luke Willis Thompson is unable, unfortunately, to join us today, but we have so much to talk about. I think that 40 minutes will go by really fast. I'm very excited to introduce Julia Halperin, who is executive editor of ArtNet in New York and moderating today. Thank you, Julia. And she'll introduce our speakers and get right with it. Please join us in giving them a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.
Hi. Oh, no. Hello, can you hear me? All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Mari said, my name is Julia Halperin. I'm the executive editor of ArtNet News, and I have the fortune of introducing our two wonderful panelists. Joining us is Jodi Throckmorton, the curator of contemporary art from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. She has served there in that role for 4 years, and before that, she was associate curator at the San Jose Museum of Art in California. She has just curated and opened a retrospective of Rena Banerjee's work, which will travel to 4 venues around the U.S. Also joining us is Chris Bedford, the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art for the last 2 years. Before that, he served as director of the Rose Art Museum for 4 years, and he was the commissioner of the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2017. So it's an interesting moment, I think, to talk about activism in the museum and sort of what that means and what the state of activism in the institution is. Museums have always been sites where, issues surrounding money, surrounding power, surrounding influence play out. And never is that more true than in moments of kind of great political and social upheaval. So we saw it in the civil rights era. We saw it during the Vietnam War. We've seen it during the AIDS crisis, and again during the culture wars of the 90s, and then very much also today. And so we are fortunate to have two people who are very much on the front lines, watching how things are changing in institutions, trying to make change in institutions, and seeing that change happen, coming at it from sort of 2 different vantage points, Chris as a museum director and Jodi as a curator. And so I was hoping to just sort of, speak to them about, how they view this, happening right now, what they're doing to shift the status quo in institutions, and, how that's different today than it may have been in the past. And so I wanted to start by just asking both of you, maybe starting with Chris, how you would define activism in the context of an art institution, and whether you consider yourself an activist.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. This is like the hangover from Judy Chicago. I walked in and it was cacophonous applause, and Judy Chicago standing on the stage, and I thought, my gosh, this is going to be amazing. So thank you all for coming, sincerely. I do think this is a really important, topical, timely discussion. I'm not sure that I'm prepared in the context of this conversation or any other to call myself an activist, but I will say that I do have a very pronounced political agenda in the work that I'm doing at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and I'm hoping that we can sort of, throughout the course of this conversation, get to the various different registers of that work. But I think just to give a little bit of context, I was recruited to become the director there, and sometimes when you're being interviewed for a directorship, it's sort of an interrogation, and at the very end, you get to ask the board what they want. And I remember asking that question directly, and the person leading the search said, we want this museum to be known as the most dynamic, civically engaged museum in the country, and the model for others to replicate. And I thought, that's the kind of museum that I would like to direct. So I think activism within the context of a very inherently and necessarily bureaucratic institution has to begin with a process of socializing change with the board. And I think you have to be both tenacious and patient simultaneously if you want to create a culture in which radical change is possible. So I would say that what differentiates the BMA maybe from other institutions, and maybe I'll just speak on behalf of my institution, is that we've embraced an idea of equity and social justice in all aspects of our museum's operations. So from acquisitions to exhibitions to public programs, staff development, and board recruitment, that is the lens through which we see development in all of those 5 categories. And the reason that we're able to drive that change so rapidly, or have been able to drive it so rapidly over the course of the last 2 years, is the Board of Trustees. So if I'm an activist, I think it's also a form of education and socialization and, finding ways to turn a battleship at the speed of a speedboat kind of thing. That's I think my job.
And I want to ask you more about that in a minute, because I think it's interesting that you come at this, from working with the bureaucracy, whereas Jodi is working more with, the art and the artists and the artwork. But before that, I want to ask you, Jodi, how would you define activism in the context of an institution?
Well, I'm not sure. I was thinking about when you said that, I'm not sure I've ever thought of myself as an activist, though I will say that my curatorial practice is always led by artists first. And so I do think that I'm more interested in artists that are activists. And part of that, being at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, we were founded in 1805, certainly by some business people in the community, but the core of that institution is that it was founded by artists, which was really inspiring to me as I was taking the job. It gives me the excuse to look at the history of American art through that perspective, and to think about how artists today are thinking about the same things, really, that those artists were thinking about, in different ways, of course, and different people. One of the things that we've been talking about is how representation matters in what you're doing, whether that be acquisitions, programs. I mean, I had that thought when we had the panel that, there's a lack of diversity on this panel even. And so thinking about how we bring that into everything that we do is a big part, and Chris mentioned some of that too.
Well, and so I want to, start digging in a little bit with Chris about kind of the how of that. So one of the things that the Baltimore Museum made headlines for this year was deaccessioning a number of works by white male artists in the collection in order to create an acquisition fund that would be dedicated to work by women and artists of color. And, we've spoken about that a number of times, and the most recent time that we spoke about it, you said something I thought was really interesting but didn't, fully understand, which was that you're doing work now to kind of make sure that that can never be undone. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what that means, and just more broadly, kind of what you're doing on different levels to make sure that the efforts that you're making now last beyond you.
So we did make headlines in deciding to deaccession those 7 paintings. I think it was a really interesting exercise, first of all, in socializing an idea with a board. So my claim was, we're living in a moment where Black American artists in particular are the leading edge of contemporary art. And so if you sort of rewind the clock to the middle years of the 20th century and you look at the rise of the abstract expressionists, that was a golden age in American art. We're living through another golden age, and that golden age is defined by principally Black American men and women working in kind of a social mode. So how do we reorient our institution to be sort of competitive in that field, such that we can amass one of the greatest collections? So that was the impulse for the deaccessioning. I think it was interesting the way it was discussed in the press, and very sensationalized, of course. Museum sells 7 paintings by white men to buy artists of color. And all of that's true, of course. But I think what was the nuance that was hidden is that, of course, the value in redundancy lies in the area of white men, because that's what we've collected for an entire century, and that's what museum cultures have valued for a century. So it's not like we would be selling works by women or by Black American artists, because we have so few. And anyway, even if we were inclined in that direction, the values wouldn't be necessary, wouldn't be the sort of requisite values to buy the kinds of things that we're after. So everything the press said to a certain extent was true, but it's also defined by history. And if, Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, was sitting up here, he would say, well, the reason that your collection is constituted that way is the transatlantic slave trade. That's it. We have valued one thing for a century or more, and our institutions, our collections, our exhibitions programs, our board of trustees, and our staffs are structured accordingly. So you have to find a way to undo those structures systematically, so that from beginning to end, and you have to rush to do it. And so it's not really about fairness, it's about equity, which are two different things. And in terms of making sure that the changes that we've made remain forever, there are things that one can do as a director within an institution and things that we can't. And sometimes those things that we can't do are a consequence of a deed of gift. So, a gallery can only be used for one purpose, or a fund, acquisition fund can only be used for one purpose. So when it comes to endowing positions or endowing acquisition funds, we've been careful to restrict the purpose of those funds or those spaces such that the trajectory that we've established for the museum is going to become part of the DNA, as opposed to something that's passing and can be undone by future generations. So that was sort of a lesson from the past.
So there is then a kind of bylaws written into this fund that you've created that says, that sort of limits what it can be used for.
Well, so a part of the fund, speak about deaccessioning specifically, although that's just part of a kind of system of change. The deaccessioning specifically, so more than half of that was designated by a donor as a spend down fund, but between sort of a year and 3 years. And so in that period of time, we do have to spend the money, and it's understood with the donor that in that short period of time, the money will be spent to advance the cause of the museum as it's now articulated in our mission and vision, which is all about equity and inclusion. So is it written into the bylaws? No. But will it be done and unable to be undone? Yes.
And, the other kind of half of this discussion is that, activism is not just happening, by and within the institution, right? It's also happening with increasing frequency, people looking at an institution and saying, maybe you aren't acting in the way that I would like you to, and a kind of increased swirl of protest surrounding institutions for any number of reasons. And so I wanted to ask you, Jodi, about that and kind of what happens in these moments, because, PAFA was the target of some, activism, some protest when, or spirited discussion, when allegations of sexual harassment against the artist Chuck Close became public, while the museum had a show of photographs by Chuck Close on view. And made the decision, not to take down the show, but rather to add a kind of introductory exhibition about, gender and power in the art world, acknowledging the allegations, and then also, organized a series of workshops for students that included. I thought that the titles were very interesting. So one was called the Museum as a Political Space, and one was called Reinterpreting the Museum. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about kind of how you all came to that decision and what it felt like to be on that side of the debate.
Right. Well, what was one of the interesting things that came out of this experience was that we had less response from outside of the institution. So maybe less, people from the public responding, and it was more about our staff and certainly our students. So PAFA has a student body of 350 BFA, MFA students, and they were really, really upset by the fact that we had this exhibition there. In fact, when the allegations came out, it provoked a lot of sort of museum staff conversations, but what else came out of it was a series of conversations with students some that got very heated, but moments when we as a staff and the students were really interfacing and thinking about talking through the issue of, do we shut this exhibition? What happened was that it brought out larger things that are happening in the world and even at the school. So it became a big moment for the institution, I would say, to discuss what was happening internally. And we did, as a staff, really based on the productivity of these discussions, decide to keep the exhibition open. One of the sessions with the students resulted in a big brainstorming sort of paper where we put down their thoughts about what's the art world that we want, this generation of people coming into the art world. That was on display as part of this exhibition that we did in response to the Chuck Close exhibition. And I will say that you couldn't enter the Chuck Close exhibition without going through this response area. So we took works from our permanent collection that talk about who are the people that have been in power, what are the myths that some of these artists and artworks have perpetuated, and who do we want to hear more from? So we took those three ideas and made selections from the permanent collection based on that. And what was really disappointing, one of the things that was disappointing to me about the experience is that not 100 feet away, we had an exhibition of art, an exhibition of all art by women. We actually have been collecting women and African-American artists. It's been a focus of PAFA for a very long time. So the fact that all the attention was going to that and not, the work that we'd been doing there was, I understand why that is, but it was something that we wanted to draw out. So we had, Barbara Kruger pieces responding to it. Makeda Ahuja, who's a wonderful painter based in Baltimore, actually. Alice Neal, so that people had to walk through that before going into the Chuck Close exhibition. And the series of programming, panel discussions. We did a writing workshop on trauma that was really a wonderful program. And then the students did get to close down the exhibition. They did a workshop on printmaking and protest in the last few weeks. And at 5 p.m. on the last day, a group of students were allowed to plaster over the doors with their prints, and they actually got to lock the door on the exhibition. So, we felt like it was a productive way of dealing with this issue.
And I wonder, did that experience change the way that you all might approach artists in the future who have, done anything on the spectrum of, bad to reprehensible? Yeah. Does that kind of change in the future the way that you plan to present work by other artists?
Yeah, I hope it does. I think it's a museum's responsibility to give that context. There's a great poster by the Guerrilla Girls where they talk about if labels were truthful. I think that there's a balanced way to do that. There's a thoughtful way to do that. But I think it is our responsibility to tell that story as best we can. We've done a lot of work going back into the historic collection. We have this room full of portraits of, men that need to be acknowledged that they made their money off of the transatlantic slave trade. So we've been going back in every sort of step and trying to tell that full story.
And one of the things that I think is interesting about this moment is that I think a lot of people working in institutions, want to see the kinds of changes that you all are making. But, wanting and doing are two very different things. And it, costs money, it takes time. It means just by virtue of how much everyone has to do that there are other things that you're not going to do. There are other things you might not buy. There are other shows there are other shows you won't do because you all are, pursuing the things that you think are the most important. And so, I wonder if you can talk about how you convince people, whether it's board members, staff, the public, to buy into what you're trying to do, and also how you decide what not to do in the process of moving your institutions in these directions. Chris?
Shall I go first? Okay. So I think it's a really good question. Sort of the enduring question for a director. I think that one way I discuss this with the Board of Trustees in particular, but really almost anyone, is relevance. I think that the key question for any institution today is how do you achieve relevance? How do you capture new audiences? How do you grow the population of people that are invested in your institution? And how do you make that sustainable? That's the total equation. So we went through, and it's much less tedious than it sounds, a strategic planning process. It was more like a sprint. Where we adopted formally the things that we were already doing. And the people leading the strategic planning process, one provocation was, how do you make yourself so essential that if the Baltimore Museum of Art shuttered its doors, there would be a protest? So I would venture to say, if the majority of civic institutions in this country just closed down, there would be a murmur, but it wouldn't be as if the public library had closed down. If the public library in the center of Baltimore closed its doors, there would be a riot because it provides such deep and essential service. So how do we constitute ourselves so that we are deeply essential and indispensable to the city? So that to me has been one of the sort of siren calls for leading the board in this effort of change. How do we become enduringly relevant? And I think it's balanced in part by a threat, which is unless we change ourselves fundamentally to face a majority black city, in the case of Baltimore, 68% black city, there is no institutional life beyond where we are unless we embrace an ethic of change that is intended to speak to that city in the way that we haven't for a century. So part of it is that I think there's a deep existential drive to change, and part of it is simply business, which is we are not a sustainable enterprise unless we become part of our time and part of our city. So I try to sort of speak in those two tongues when discussing the necessity to shift.
And I mean, does that work? Is sustainability, which do you find is the most convincing? Is it sustainability, or is it relevance, or is it, what is it that you can tell kind of registers with people and specifically with your board?
I mean, so my response, this may be quite specific to our board, but I think that there's a whole collision of factors that precipitated a change in direction for the museum. So one of them was the recognition that Baltimore is a black majority city. And another was that the creative core of that city is absolutely extraordinary, and again is being led principally by black artists working in a variety of mediums. Another is my observation coming from the outside of Baltimore and as a non-American, that artists like Mark Bradford, Theaster Gates, Rick Lowe have for years and years now been driving change through a dual focus on formal innovation and sustainable need-based social activism. And then there was the rather startling fact that our visitation numbers were generously staying at a level, or rather declining. So, to me that had to do with a lack of engagement with the present moment in Baltimore. So when you put together those variety of factors, I think the board, and also I am very convinced by the fact that if we change orientation, not only do we capture a city, but we kind of grab the zeitgeist by the scruff of the neck, because this is what's happening right now. And it's been the responsibility of the BMA from its inception to the present to be really bold in relationship to the most vital things happening right here and right now. So in a certain way, yes, it's new, but also if you go back to the founding documents of the museum, and some of those defining moments in our museum's history, like the Cone Collection arriving, at the time the Cone Collection arrived, that was really radical. So
Explain what that is for people who don't know.
Oh, so the Cone Collection is one of the greatest collections of mid-century French modernism in the world. We have the deepest, greatest collection of Matisse in the world. And it took a long time for the museum to decide to accept the collection because the city didn't know who Matisse was, hard as that is to believe. So it took sort of decades of convincing for the museum to say, in fact, yes, we're going to accept this collection. So I try and toggle back and forth between being radical in the present and being true to our DNA, which are basically the same thing.
And Jodi, what about you? How do you kind of get buy-in?
Right. There's a lot of education that we do. You know, I think acquisitions perhaps is the best way to think about this. And when I got to PAFA, I thought that history would be my biggest competitor, because you know we have like the icons of American art, historic American art at PAFA, and I thought, how am I as a contemporary curator going to compete with that? But it's become my best friend. We recently acquired a piece by Sonia Clark, who's a wonderful artist that did a performance with us called Unraveling. And so she invites museum visitors for 3 or 4 hours to join her in unraveling the Confederate flag. And we worked with our committee to actually acquire that piece. PAFA hasn't done a lot of acquiring performance, so that was a hurdle that had to be crossed as well. But I admit the discussion was lengthy over the acquisition, and it got heated at some points. But what really I think sold it was someone saying, well, when you look at these Benjamin West pictures or this Gilbert Stuart of George Washington, this is political art. This is propaganda in some ways. And finally, I'm lucky, frankly, that I have a collections committee where people are willing to say, this may not be for me, I may not like it, but I know that this is an important work of art and we want to acquire it. So that's helped a lot, is to show that it's a continuum, and it's a very long story that will continue.
And you know, something else I've been thinking about a lot in the context of this discussion is sort of how you judge success, because I think, you know, some of these things, you know, we're talking about doing on a 1 to 3 year basis, but some of them, you know, take a really long time. Some of them, when it comes to, you know, bringing artists into the collection who may not be shown for a long time, who may be considered really differently in 100 years. I mean, we're talking like, you guys are working on kind of a 1 to like 500 year range here. And so, and I think that also kind of brings up choices that you have to make about, you know, what am I going to prioritize? Am I going to prioritize, you know, changing how the institution interacts with the community now, or on a kind of 5-year basis? Do I want my goal to be that because of the work that I do, art history books look different in 100 years? How do you kind of, you know, navigate between those decisions about, you know, where you're putting your energy and what kind of time frame you're thinking about?
I mean, for me, when I'm thinking about, I've said this a few times as I've been talking to people this week, is that I try to think about what's going to be relevant in the next 2 years. But I think about the works in the collection by artists, you know, I don't know, from 1920, for example, that no one knows, but that are amazing works of art that still have a story of that time period to tell. And so, I mean, it is, you know, it's difficult to predict the future. I joke that I'm like a psychic, and that's why they hired me, but, you know, no one ever laughs at that joke. But it's like an interesting thing, because I feel like you have to hit both points. We won't know if we hit the second one. But I think there is something to be said about being relevant and having these things really mean something in the moment. And I wonder, I'm sorry, and I wonder if actually, you know, as we think about artists and what they're doing, and a lot of the work that's being made is made with ephemeral materials, or maybe not necessarily with the with the idea that it'll last 150 years even. I mean, maybe we're at a point where we need to rethink that idea in a museum too.
So just to elaborate slightly, before I mention that difference between fairness and equity, so we discussed that a great deal at the museum. So you could say it's fair, for instance, to hang a Mark Rothko next to a Norman Lewis. But actually that does not undo 100 years of conscious and unconscious bias. So in my view, what you have to, my objective right now is to shift the DNA of the BMA, and if it can have resounding effects elsewhere, great. But the idea is that in a short period of time, you sort of sprint and do one thing with an incredible determination, better than any other museum. So that doesn't mean that we will be doing that one thing at the same pace with the same vigor forever. But what I'm after is that moment where the museum has changed forever by a period of, you know, intense action. So to revert back to my discussion of the Cone collection, for instance. So when that collection arrived at the BMA, it completely changed the museum in that moment, and has continued to, over time, even in the present. We're in the process of thinking about what a Center for Métis Studies would look like, for instance. So if you go all the way back to the 40s and the arrival of that collection, it is resounded over decades and decades and decades. So I'm after that kind of change now. How do you achieve that kind of change in the present? I think most of what we're doing is formulated around that concept. So some of that is speculation, and which you discussed. You have to look forward and try to understand what would be relevant. I'll also say that another safer way to do it is by looking back. So if we have been engaged in a kind of collecting practice that's based on conscious and unconscious bias for decades, that suggests that there are things that we were not buying as institutions and individuals based on those biases. So in fact, going back in history, doing a proper degree of research and figuring out who was doing what of incredible importance that didn't enter a museum collection, but still feels relevant and timely and important today, is a kind of safer way to go about that correction. So, Norman Lewis, Alma Thomas are some of the leading lights, but if you just dig a little bit deeper than those transformative figures, you find a whole range of artists, men and women of color, working for a century that have not entered museum collections that are shown in this fair. So that would add incredible texture and depth to a museum collection, and that doesn't involve seeing the future. It actually involves doing substantial research into the past, which is a little safer.
And I mean, I'm just curious, because we're at a fair, when you're doing that, are you, where are you looking? Where are your curators looking to actually buy and bring that stuff in?
So what I would say is that they're not looking, well, with all due respect towards Art Basel, which is fabulous in every aspect, if you're coming to an art fair for ideas as a curator or a director, then that's not a good thing. You can certainly come here to buy and look and develop your collection by working with some of the greatest galleries in the world, but the ideas probably should not emanate here. I think the ideas come from primary research and a deep look at history. And that deep look at history will unearth figures that you don't see represented in your collection. And so then the step you have to take is, who is selling that work? Is that work being sold at all? Is it being held in the States? How do I access it? How do I, assess it? And it's a really exciting and interesting process, which is quite different from, walking up and down the streets of Chelsea, which is exciting too. It's just different.
Who would be a couple of artists that you think of in that category?
I'll give you one really good example. It's on the tip of my tongue. This is not giving art tips to anyone. But there is a woman who lives in her 80s who lives and works in Baltimore named Valerie Maynard. And she's I would say, early 80-year-old African-American woman. I was referred to her sort of word of mouth, went to visit her studio and figured out that she was a cohort of Jack Witt and Melvin Edwards, was really involved in the founding of the Studio Museum in Harlem, in fact, set up their first print studio that was part of the sort of the founding principles of the institution. I reached out to Thelma Golden to understand who she was. Thelma said I hadn't heard that name in years, but this is some of the context for the work that Valerie did. So she isn't commercially represented, or she is very sporadically. Her name is not part of the canon of art history, but the work is absolutely extraordinary. So that just means sort of following a trail and going beyond the normative research lines, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to make sure that we took a moment to talk about the internet. You can't talk about activism in the institution today without considering the impacts that the internet has had. I mean, that's something that in kind of previous moments of foment we haven't dealt with. And we're at a point today where a photo of a work of art or a comment can ping around the world in 30 seconds. And often, people who are responding to what you're doing may not have seen the work in question. They may not have even been to your institution. And so, I'm hoping that you can talk, and also notably, some of the work that you all have been doing has been the subject of right-wing backlash, which I think is something that, institutions, I think we're used to getting it from the left a little bit more than from the right. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of what impact the internet has had on your work and, in what ways it's made it easier and harder? Maybe Jodi, we can start with you.
Yeah. We had a I guess a right-wing response to the Sonia Clark performance that we held. A photo of actually some of the me and a few of the people at the museum were posted online on Facebook, and there was a lot of really horrific comments. It's not fun. But that someone from, I don't know, it was Alabama or something. It was no one that had even seen the piece or been anywhere near Philadelphia, but they somehow caught on to the story and word spread like fire. So for a few weeks, it was just constant on our Facebook page. I mean, for me, I kept thinking, there are so many people that have been fighting way harder than I have and have received way more strife for what we're doing. So what they're doing. So I felt like I have nothing to complain about compared to what, it's just a dose of what so many artists receive, the backlash that they receive to their work. So it's a really big moment for that. But I think we have seen the internet and even social media, it can be a productive site for conversation. I remember reading posts from colleagues and conversations on Facebook, for example, after the Whitney Biennial with Dana Schutz. There was a lot of interesting and even fruitful dialogue, I would say, that came out through social media.
The backstory of that for people who don't know.
Yes. It was a painting showed in the Whitney Biennial by Dana Schutz of Emmett Till. And that created a lot of conversation and a lot of protests by artists and others. And it was interesting to see that, and how even some scholarship that has quickly come out about that moment has looked at the social media, which is really, I think it's really exciting. And I think it is a forum for opinions, but it's all opinions. there's no censoring it.
I think all of that, I would echo all of that, and also say that one way we sometimes describe the BMA, and I'm sure this goes for your institution as well, is that it's the biggest classroom in Baltimore. But that concept of the classroom is very much constrained by the physical building. So I think one thing that the internet can do, social media, whatever, is make that classroom massive, almost endless. And in addition, it diversifies the classroom substantially, and I don't mean that as code for racial diversity or gender-based diversity. I mean it's political diversity, it's class-based diversity, and I think one thing that can be a problem within museums that some of our trustees sometimes point out is that we have a kind of default left-leaning sensibility within the museum and on the board. But that isn't necessarily representative of the entire population that you're trying to engage. So how do you harvest those views and try to incorporate them into your program and speak more productively to people who might have a different political leaning from yourself? I think that's a really valid point, because we want to speak in many tongues to many people, and the internet is incredibly helpful with that. Because those views, presumably, that you had directed towards your institution wouldn't necessarily be represented by your board or by your staff. Right. So it's instructive to know and find ways to respond and engage, and I think that's the principal use of digital media for me.
And the last question before we turn it over to you all is thinking kind of ahead and looking ahead about the future of activism and kind of future fault lines. And I think, one of the things that I've been thinking about is around, feeling like the next battle is going to be around funding. So we've seen it recently with, museums returning money from an organization backed by the Saudi royal family after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And very recently, I think this week, we've seen it at the Whitney Museum surrounding a board member who owns a company that produces tear gas that was used at the border. And that's just two. I mean, I think there have been a real steady clip in the last about 6 months of these moments where people are really asking their institutions to think about where they're getting their money from. And so I wonder, do you all think about advocacy kind of expanding to reevaluating your own sources of funding, and are there certain circumstances where you wouldn't accept money?
I'll
Jodi?
go first because I think you're the bigger one on this. Well, I think it comes down to a few things. There's transparency issues, certainly about who's funding and their political agenda and all of that throughout the art world. It affects what artists get shown. I mean, there's so much that should be more transparent in the art world. I mean, I think that we need to think about that, and I think we also need to think about how much power donors have over how the money's directed. That's something that's not, are they allowed, if they have an agenda, when they give money, how much say do they have over what's being shown in the curatorial program, for example? I mean, I think that's a real way of thinking about it. I'm not sure, and it's also, do you investigate the ties of every single person that gives you money? Do you dive down those deep holes? And I'm asking you now.
I'm totally ignoring you.
Okay. It's an amazing question, I think, because I think we can all acknowledge that arts funding isn't easy. Fundraising's hard, and so it's a larger problem when we're not getting state funds or national funds. How we support ourselves.
So I would say two things. And a mission and a vision for an institution only have integrity when they're enacted across every category of the museum. So it's actually it wouldn't be a revolution in museum practice only to do exhibitions focused on Black Americans. Or one exhibition that has a social justice agenda. It has to permeate every single aspect of the museum's culture, up to and including your fundraising activities. So my answer to your question is, I believe that the BMA in its current incarnation would not accept funding from sources that did not accord with the vision and mission that we've adopted as a museum. I believe that. And a really good example is the Meyerhoff Commission that we just announced. And so it's the first named commission in the public space in the American Museum. It's named by Bob Meyerhoff, the great American collector, and it comes with a fellowship specifically for an artist of color, or a young aspiring curator of color, to work in this case alongside Micheline Thomas in realizing a commission that will happen in 2019. So that's sort of the utopian idea of receiving money with a direction that's resoundingly positive and aligned with the museum's mission. But I say that to say it's possible. And that was a substantial endowment gift. So I fortunately never had to be in a position where I said no to something, but it's really great to be able to say yes to something that's so good.
All right, well, thank you both. I'd love if we could open it up to questions if anyone has one. I think we have mics coming around.
Hi. So great talk. I really enjoyed it. First, I want to say that both of you are in a position where you do have a say within your institution, right? You are the director and curator, and you guys have more or less an opinion on what's showing. So how do you make an impact within your community or within what you want your institution or believe your institution should say when you're not in those positions?
That's really great, actually. I have people talk to me all the time. Maybe the people you have to find. Maybe you find the people in your organization that are willing to listen to you, which hopefully there are a lot. And it's the best. That's where I learn the most is from for example, our visitor services people. They're interfacing with the community more than I am in any given day. And we should all be listening to other people that don't have power in these organizations. So I think that you do that. I think that the students at PAFA, for example, they make their voice heard about everything we do. And that is, I think you email, I think you call, I think you do all those things. And get together with a group of people too that feel a similar way. That's what I would recommend.
I mean, I would say that listening is really essential to achieving relevance. And so one really interesting anecdote that's very brief is that the BMA in 1939 was the first institution to do a show focused on the work of African-American artists in the US, 1939-38. And so it's a glorious thing on one hand, but the museum didn't buy anything from the show. So we have archival images, and we can celebrate the fact that we did it, but we didn't buy anything. So we were not that committed. But the reason the show happened was because the director at that time issued a call to the entire city of Baltimore, asking what kind of exhibition that city wanted to see. And they said, we want to see an exhibition of work by Black artists. So the museum did it. So I always go back to that and think, how do we listen in that same way? Like, how do we develop a mechanism so that we can deliver that show, whatever that might be, that the city wants in 2018? I think that is a really interesting exercise.
You spoke a bit about the curatorial, the content of your exhibition programming, but you haven't spoken about the composition of the board or the administrations at your institutions. And I'm wondering how much you feel that the board of trustees and or board of directors and the administration and curatorial staff should reflect the demographic of the region that your institutions serve, and do your institutions have diversity on in those areas?
Yeah, I have less say on those issues at the institution, but I believe 100% that it should, and PAFA has a lot of room to improve. We need to work on it, and I know that our leadership is working on it and thinking about changing things from the top down, because it is extremely important. We were working on a project. We acquired an entire estate of an artist named John Roden, who is an incredible mid-century African-American artist, and that came with an endowed fellowship to work on that project for an African-American curator. So we've been working. I know that we've been working with donors to get those fellowships funded, because there's a lot of work that we have to do to change those fields in that way, and a lot of it is there's donor-driven things really do help in that way to build those programs.
So I would say that that's the most essential question. So it's actually very easy. If you have strong directorial leadership, it's really easy to change public programs, exhibitions, and acquisitions. I mean, you can simply, if you're persuasive enough in the boardroom and you have a vision that you can sell, you can do those things. Easy-ish. It's more difficult to change the board and the staff to bring those two components into alignment with the program. So the BMA, again, has tons of work to do. But our board of trustees is now 1/3 people of color. That's pretty different than what I found 2 years ago. And our new chief curator, Uzma Naeem, who just came from the National Portrait Gallery, is one of the only chief curators of color in a major institution in the US. So what I would say is you just have to make a decision and do the right thing. And try to find a way to sustain that change in every decision that you make. But it's not appropriate. This is one thing I believe. It is not appropriate for Mark Bradford to represent the US in Venice, for Martin Purrier to be the next artist, and to have the curatorial ranks remain monolithically white. That's not okay. That doesn't make sense, and it's not sustainable. So, the two changes have to happen concurrently.
And I would just add, there was a study done by the Mellon Foundation in 2014 or 2015 that found, looking at American institutions, that African-American curators were 8% of all curatorial staff at institutions across the US. And that number, I think, has not changed dramatically since then. There are various initiatives that have been formed by consortia and institutions to kind of shift that in the long term. But the numbers right now are really, really bad.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Justin Giles. I'm the oral historian for the Tateki Museum for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, right up the road here, if you will. I actually grew up in Washington, D.C. My mom is a full-blood Muskogee Creek and Cherokee woman, and my dad is a full-blood white guy from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so go Steelers. So I think I qualify as a person of color, eh? As we say, my dad changes more colors than my mom ever did, so. My question is, I again grew up in Washington, D.C., worked for the Smithsonian National Museum there in Indian for about 10 years or so, and I'm very familiar with Baltimore. I played lacrosse at University of Virginia, Iroquois Nationals, so I have a little thing against Johns Hopkins, but I work with them as well. My thing is, you kind of answered it too, but where did you grow up, by the way, Director?
I was born in Scotland and raised in England.
There it is. So how does it feel as a I guess, you didn't grow up in America, right? And obviously
since I was 17, yeah.
17, all right. And then did you grow up in Baltimore?
No.
My question is, kind of a personal question is, how does it feel to be a director of a Baltimore Museum of Art, trying to be engaged in social activism, and knowing what Baltimore is as far as being 68% Black, African-American, people of color? And again, we have a lot of common as far as Native people and everything else with Scotland and Wales and everything else too. It's a personal question. I mean, that's a big thing for you to be doing. How do you connect more, I guess is the question.
Well, I mean, I think that I've talked about this a lot with artists. I think that it sometimes helps to be in a third space, which is not, in this case, is not American. And I don't think that is hugely, hugely helpful, but it does allow you to step back a little bit and look at a culture that doesn't feel like your own. And I think that can sometimes be a little bit liberating. The other way to answer your question would just be to say, I really believe in site specificity, which is a concept stolen from artists. So you're not a director anyway, you're a director in a specific place. So what are the specific needs of that community, and how does your background, how can you mobilize your background, your expertise, and your interests to serve that city? So I always joke Baltimore wasn't my only choice. I chose Baltimore. And I chose it because I felt that there was an alignment between artistic excellence in an emerging generation of American artists and the needs of that city. And I felt if I could put the two together, then we could change the way the institution functioned relative to the city. So it's actually really deeply programmatic, and it's based on not only a kind of moral imperative, which I do really deeply believe in, but it's also, it's one of circumstance. I mean, the BMA can only achieve relevance if it speaks to its community. So my job is to make it speak. So how do you do that? I think there's really only one answer.
I'm thinking about sustainability in regard to what you're talking about, and I'm also reflecting on the question about staff. Okay, staff in relationship to these institutions, but beyond staff, beyond board, donors. So major donors who are really ultimately the ones responsible for sustaining institutions. How do you influence and start to educate and shift donors' perspectives about why this is important? And beyond Baltimore, where you can make a really clear case when you're in a place that is predominantly white, how do you think about engaging and informing and shifting kind of responsibilities, global human responsibilities that enable this moment that you're talking about, that we're seeing at the fair, to really be sustainable?
I mean, I think it goes back to some of what we were saying about, well, some of it is education, I think. I've been at PAF for 4 years, and I think it's only now, really, I feel like I've got a group of people that are committed to working with me to show the things that I think that I think is important for Philadelphia and that we do at PAFA. Yeah, I think it's also, there are donors that really believe in these things, and we're lucky to have some at PAFA. So it is finding those matches. Doing the things is really important. So showing you're committed to it, not once, as you mentioned earlier, but over 4 years, for example. I think those things go a long way in sustainability. Because it's also, I mean, you have to be committed to it over a period of time, and I think it does take time to do it. You've been able to do it quickly, maybe.
Right. Well, I mean, I will always say that Baltimore, I don't think was going to be able to tolerate a long period of waiting. So I remember this really decisive conversation I had with the artist Amy Sherald, who was responsible for Michelle Obama's portrait. who is also a trustee of the BMA. And she, because she's a merciful and gentle person, did not correct me in the boardroom when I said this. She just took me aside afterwards and corrected me. So I said something like, the city of Baltimore is now ready for the kind of change we're executing, which sounded fine, and convincing in the present. But what she said to me quietly afterwards was, the city has been ready for decades. It's only now that the museum is reorienting itself towards the needs of the city. So I think about, that all the time, the urgency and speed that's necessary to make change. I don't think it's enough to talk and plan. And I think particularly in a city like Baltimore, the hand-wringing and the talking and the strategic planning, that it's really counterproductive. That's how you lose the faith of a city. I think right now requires action. And sustainability is one thing, but also just taking decisive action in the present is maybe more important right now.
Just going inside of Basel and seeing, maybe I'd probably say 20% of the work in there is, I would say, probably done by people of color, 20 to 25%. So I still don't understand why there's not representation in these institutions like that. And I think that the institutions are going to get left behind more and more. Like, it's time to kind of wake up. Like, did you see the numbers that I'm not saying you, but have they noticed the numbers that Black Panther did? It's like everybody's ready. And whoever can put aside their fear is going to be the first one to, jump that broom and be recognized. So it's been time. So
I agree with you 100%. And I, obviously, based on the program at the BMA, we're trying to attest to exactly that conviction in everything we do. I would also say, just on a sort of systematic level, I didn't have any idea what the actual percentage representation of artists of color is in the fair adjacent to us as we speak. I mean, you're probably roughly right, 20, 25%, and that is, again, you're correct, that's not representational. So what I would point to is not the quality of the work being produced, because clearly the quality of the work being produced by people of color is adequate to a more than 50% representation in there. What I would say is, and I don't even think it's on the part of the collectors and what collectors are willing to buy, I think it has to do with who's owning and operating the galleries. I mean, that's another pressing question. So it's not just the absence of people of color directing museums or as chief curators, it's as owners of major, powerful commercial galleries, dictating, the agendas of those commercial entities with vast power. So that, that's going to have to change at some point too, if you're, in my view, if you're going to see proper representation in that space. Fortunately, that's not my job. That's not part of my job. Somebody else has to tackle that. But yeah, I think I think about that issue all the time.
And institutions and collectors drive that, right? They're going to go to the market. So the more, we've really been thinking very thoughtfully about that. And I think that, it's been amazing to see in the last 2 or 3 years even, maybe 4 years, like how much it's changed in there. And the fair, I think it's driven by, it is ultimately driven by demand too, which is great.
And I would just add, we did a study looking at the representation of not all artists of color, but just of African American artists over the last 8 years in 30 institutions across the U.S., as well as in the market. And I think there's been so much talk about a shift that I think we also kind of overestimate how much that's happened already, because you see it at fairs, so you think it's kind of saturated all of these institutions, when in reality, we found that 2% of acquisitions at these institutions had been of work by African American artists, and around 7% of exhibitions. And also a lot of that had happened in the last 2 to 3 years, as opposed to, the numbers in the last year were almost more than anything we'd seen in the last 9. And so, I think it's something that without numbers, it's so easy to just be like, oh, these are the things that I saw, so this is the change that's happening. But it's so much more structural, and the roots go so much deeper that it's going to take a lot of really, conscious effort from a lot of people to shift that over time. Should we do one more? One more? One more? Okay, one quick one. It's just you back there. Oh, just over there, the middle row. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, we'll go quick because I know we're running over now.
No problem. Hi, great panel, great discussion. So my name is Lisa Russell, and I'm a filmmaker, and I curate artist performances at the UN. And when you talk about sort of institutional sort of, ways to kind of allow artists to really fully engage and share their art form, one of the things that I've talked about is it's not enough for people to speak on behalf of artists, but we need to have a space to speak for ourselves. So I'm curious in terms of your board, in terms of your trustees, do you actually have artist activists who are involved in the decision-making processes of your institutions?
Yeah, so I believe really fervently that you need artists on your board. They're a sort of mechanism for keeping you honest. They can speak in really plain parlance in the boardroom, and everybody listens because they're famous. So, I mean, it really does work. So you have to choose them carefully, of course, because they have to be directly on message. But in the event that you find those sort of unicorn figures, it can really, really help when you're trying to drive change. So the 2 people that we have on our board pending, there is another coming, but the 2 that we have at the moment are Amy Sherald and Adam Pendleton. So they're both, they were both selected because they have sort of roots in the community, but also are very mission aligned through the work that they do and can speak with a real conviction to the direction. So that is hugely helpful as a form of education and motivation.
Yeah, in terms of the committees that I work, it's more exhibitions committee and acquisitions committee, and there are artists in all of those on all of those committees, and those, like I said, they're my allies in this. So and they're that reinforcing voice that yes, this is what we need to be doing. And luckily at PAFA, we are an institution that trusts artists for the most part because they make up so much of who we are. So I think it could be more. I think we could always have more, but there are those platforms.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.